Well, shalom. My name is Todd Bennett, and this is the audio version of the weekly message sent out by Shema Israel. This week's message was titled A Light to the Nations, and it was sent out on day 9 of month 13 on the Creator's calendar, also known as March 12th, 2022 on the Roman Gregorian calendar. Now, last week I spoke about the plan of Elohim and how those pushing for a great reset are actually working within his master plan, or should I say, the master's plan. As I said in that message, I'm working on a book titled The Messiah in Context, because I don't believe most people on earth fully understand the purpose of Yeshua's first and second coming. If you read or listened to the message last week, you received a perspective that few Christians raised within the church ever hear. And I also was announcing that the audio versions are now available on YouTube. And of course, if you're listening to this, you know that. But if you don't get the written newsletter, I recommend that you go to the shemaisrael.net website and sign up for the written newsletter so you can have that as well. I mentioned that I was going to be brief in the message because of the United in Yah praise and worship event that was broadcast live on YouTube when this was sent out. And actually, if you missed it, it's recorded. So you can go to the United in Yah YouTube channel and you can watch that for yourself if you like. They're really great events. I have the privilege of opening and closing them with prayer and a shofar blast, and in between we've got people from all over the nations just lifting up the name of Yah. And so again, that's United in Yah on YouTube. Now I wanted to elaborate a bit on the message from last week because context is critical. Yeshua came when the kingdom of Israel was divided, and the majority of the Israelites, the house of Israel, also known as the 10 lost tribes, they were in exile. They were scattered among the nations as punishment for their sins. Yah had already warned them of the consequences of disobedience in Leviticus 26:33. I will scatter you among the nations and draw out a sword after you. Your land shall be desolate and your cities waste. Of course, there were many warnings on the same subject, that they would be cast out of the land and that they would be scattered amongst the nations. And of course, that's exactly what happened to them. Thankfully, Yah also provided the following promise. He says, yet for all that, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, nor shall I abhor them to utterly destroy them and break my covenant with them, for I am Yahuwah, their Elohim. But for their sake I will remember the covenant of their ancestors, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt in the sight of the nations, that I might be their Elohim. I am Yahuwah. So despite all their sins and rejecting the instructions of Yah, he promised that he would remember the covenant. Now, did you catch the last part of that, the text of Leviticus 26? He brought their ancestors out of Egypt in the sight of all the nations. Now, he could have raptured them out of Egypt in secret in the middle of the night if he wanted to, but that's not how Yah operates. He was making a statement, and the purpose was twofold. The plagues were a punishment upon the nation of Egypt, and it was also done in such a dramatic way that all of the nations of the earth could learn about Yah and his name. So when people from the nations came to Egypt, there were major trade routes associated with Egypt, and people would come and see the devastation, and it would and ask, well, who did this? What did this? And of course, they would say Yahuwah, the Elohim of the Israelites. And so essentially, he was revealed and he was magnified in the sight of all the nations when they saw what he did to Egypt. In fact, in Exodus 9:16 it says, but indeed for this purpose I have raised you up, that I may show my power in you, and that my name may be declared in all the earth. And of course, If you're talking about all the earth, you're talking about all the nations of the earth. So while the Israelites would be punished and scattered in the nations if they failed to abide by the covenant, Yah promised that he would remember them and gather their descendants. He says, "Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your descendants from the east and gather you from the west. I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not keep them back. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Everyone who is called by my name, whom I have created for my esteem, I have formed him, yes, I have made him. Bring out the blind people who have eyes, and the deaf who have ears. Let all the nations be gathered together, and let the people be assembled. Who among them can declare this and show us former things? Let them bring out their witnesses, that they may be justified. Or let them hear and say, it is truth. You are my witnesses, says Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no El formed, nor shall there be after me." So Israel would be witnesses for Yah and serve his purpose to reveal his truth to the nations. Ideally, they would do it as priests through obedience, but they would even be serving him in punishment. They were supposed to be priests to the nations, and they were supposed to draw the nations to Yah. And that would happen if they obeyed, and people would say, well, why is this nation so wise? Why are they so blessed? And they could point the people to Yah and say, this is why. Our Elohim blesses us. But if they disobeyed, obviously they wouldn't provide that type of witness, so then they would be punished, and that would be a testimony that Yah said this would happen if they did not obey. So either way, they would be witnesses. Now Moses was told that another would be sent to lead Israel like him. In Deuteronomy 18 through 19, it says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." Now, here's a prophecy concerning the promised one who would lead Israel back to Yah. "And now Yahweh says, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, so that Israel is gathered to him. For I shall be glorious in the eyes of Yah, and my Elohim shall be my strength. Indeed, he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the nations, that you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth." So we can see that the role of this promised one, it was not going to be just to bring the tribes back to Elohim, but to actually bring all the nations, shine as a light and bring all the nations back to Elohim. So it essentially was a twofold prophecy. That light would come from the Galilee of the nations, according to 9:1-2, which reads, "Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, in Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light has shined." Now, why was it called Galilee of the nations? Well, because the Galilee used to belong to the tribes of the house of Israel, who were scattered throughout the nations, and it was filled with people from the nations by the Assyrian Empire. And a lot of people don't realize that, but that was the modus operandi of the Assyrian Empire. When they defeated a people, they would utterly remove them from their native land, and then replace them with foreigners that they'd conquered from other nations. So they would move these people around so they didn't have any, patriotic attachments to the land. They would just be placed there, and they could subjugate them much easier. And that's what happened to the house of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. They were conquered by the Assyrian Empire and removed from the land by the Assyrian Empire. And through all these movements, they ended up being scattered throughout the entire planet. Now again, can you see the focus on the nations and the house of Israel within the Master's plan? We know that Yeshua was the promised light. He was described as the true light, which gives light to every man coming into the world. Yeshua specifically stated, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And he wasn't speaking in abstract terms. He was referring to the prophecy in Isaiah 9 and others that described him as a light to the nations. In fact, when Yeshua was born, a man named Simeon was led by the Spirit to the temple, where an offering was being presented according to the Torah, because his mother Mary was in an unclean state until the offering was made, and that was 7 days from male. And we know that he was circumcised on his 8th day, so it makes sense that this would have been the time when they went to make that offering and circumcise Yeshua in Jerusalem on the 8th day after his birth. Now here's how Simeon was described. And behold, there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was just and devout, waiting for the consolation of Yisrael, and the holy, set-apart Spirit was upon him. Now it's interesting because, wait, what are you talking about? The Holy Spirit was upon him? I thought that didn't happen until Acts 2. Well, no, if we understand the scriptures properly, we see that the Spirit was operating all through what people refer to as the Old Testament. The Holy Spirit was operating through people, through all sorts of prophetic giftings and others. So Simeon had the Holy Spirit upon him, and he was waiting for the consolation of Yisrael. Well, what on earth is that? Well, the Greek word paraklesis can mean consolation and joy. A parakletos is defined as one called or sent for to assist another, an advocate, or one who pleads the cause of another. And this is how Yeshua was specifically described in 1 John 2:1 as an advocate. Now, read what Simeon said. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to bring revelation to the nations, and the glory of your people, Israel. So you see the two-fold aspect of his purpose. On that day, the child was officially named Yeshua, Yahushua, the name given to him by the messenger before he was conceived in the womb. We read about that in Luke 2:21. Yahushua actually means the salvation of Yah. It's composed of two words, two names, and we saw that with the patriarch Joshua, whose original name was Hosea, which means salvation, and his name was changed to Yahushua. And so you had the name of Yah attached to Hosea. Yah saves, Yah salvation. Simeon literally saw the child that was named for his purpose, salvation. And that's why it is so important to use his proper name. I see so many ministries and people starting to kind of revert back to Jesus. Now, they may have got some revelation about the name and saw the importance of the name, and yet I see them using, Yeshua Jesus, and it's important to understand that Jesus is connected with the child Zeus, and we should not be mixing. We should be using his correct name. Yeshua is the salvation offered by Yah, not Zeus. And names are critically important, and if you want to truly understand Yah and what's important to him, you need to understand that diligence and names are extremely important to him. We see that all through the scriptures. Yeshua walked and taught throughout the Galilee of the nations. And by doing so, he literally revealed himself to the nations. He brought revelation to the nations. He shined a light to the nations, and he was the prophesied light to those nations. Now remember, at that time, again, the house of Israel was in the nations. And Yeshua specifically said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he came through Judah, who, by the way, was hanging on by a thread to the covenant in order to advocate for the house of Israel. He had to come and be birthed through the covenant. But we know that Judah was just not, they were about to be judged, and they were about to be dispersed and exiled by the Romans within a generation after Yeshua was crucified and resurrected. But Yeshua reinforced his message to the nations and his prophetic purpose by literally sending out 12 first, representing the reunited Israel. In Luke 9, we read that he sent out the 12, how he sent out the 12 disciples. It says, Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of Elohim and to heal the sick. So by gathering those 12, he was showing that he was going to reconcile the divided nation of Israel, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, bring them together as prophesied by many of the prophets. Commonly, Ezekiel talks about the two sticks and bringing together the two sticks, but we read about the reconciliation throughout many of the prophets. So he's showing by gathering the 12 that he would reunite the kingdom of Israel. And later in Luke 12, we read how he then sent out 70. And recall that 70 is the number that represents the nations. And it says, After these things the master appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go. So he sent out the 70 representing the nations, and then he went to all those places to reveal himself to the nations. He later returned to Jerusalem, pronounced judgment on the house of Judah and Jerusalem, and renewed the covenant with the 12. Again, they represented the restored people of Israel, and the point was that the covenant was being renewed with Israel. And that was the prophesied promise, after all. We read in Jeremiah 31, Behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when I will make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them, says Yah. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, says Yahweh, I will put my Torah in their minds and write it on their hearts, and I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. Jeremiah 31 through 33. The house of Israel will have the Torah in their minds and written on their hearts. That is why Yeshua came for those lost sheep and later sent the Spirit. We read about in Acts 2. If you are one of those lost sheep that Yeshua found, then you need to follow the Spirit. You need to allow the Spirit to inscribe the Torah upon your heart, and you must have it in your mind. Now, this is quite the opposite of the typical Christian response to the good news of the Messiah. The popular doctrine of grace often includes the mistaken belief that the Messiah did away with the Torah through his death. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. That's why so many who think they're in a relationship with Yeshua will be told to depart, and they'll be shut out of the wedding. They are lawless, and I discussed that in a previous teaching. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's important to recognize there's no separate category for the Christian church, and there's no Christian exemption from obedience. Israel is the only assembly of people who Yah has a covenant with here on earth. There is the covenant assembly of Israel, and then there are the nations, though they follow after their other gods. So If you want to be in covenant with Yah, it must be through Israel. You must be willing to come out of the nations, come out of Babylon. And Yeshua's purpose was clear, and he did not deviate from it. The only way you get to the Father is through him, because he was the promised one who renewed the covenant with Israel. He is the way, and you must be certain to follow him on the path that he has revealed into the assembly of Israel. This has nothing to do with becoming Jewish or the modern state of Israel, and everything to do with the set-apart assembly of Israel, consisting of a people who follow the instructions of Yah. That's what he's looking for, a family that he can fill his kingdom with. Now, those of us scattered through the nations must recognize that we're not home yet. We are Israel, but we're still in exile. And while we're scattered among the nations, we must fulfill the pattern of the 70 and preach the good news before Yeshua returns. The people of the nations who desire to become his people must join into the assembly of Israel through the covenant renewed by the shed blood of Yeshua. The culmination of the end of the age will involve a fulfillment of the purpose of the nations that were created at Babel. As the nations unite in rebellion against Yah, he will judge those nations and deliver his people through that judgment, like he did in Egypt. Instead of one nation, though, it will be all the nations of the earth. The only question is, who among those nations will see his banner and run to the light? Barakot. My name is Todd Bennett from ShemaIsrael.net. Shalom.